Mhm. So welcome to the last get-together of 2020, and it's a pleasure to introduce Giorgos Kallis, who almost needs no introduction, certainly to anybody familiar with the work on ecological economics and on political ecology, where he's been a major contributor for the past many years. He is an ICRIA research professor, and I thought I should mention what ICRIA is for those who might not know. It's the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies in Spain. And he holds this professorship and has held it for the past decade now at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, often called ICTA, at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He has consistently focused on degrowth and is one of its main proponents, and has a political economic argument for ways in which to move past environmental degradation and in keeping with limits to growth. I won't say much more about it. I won't stand between you and him, but I will say that for this seminar, Giorgos has picked the Case for Degrowth, which is a book published by Wiley, where he and three other co-authors, who are Susan Paulson, Giacomo Di Alisa, and Federico Di Maria, have put forward the case for degrowth, and many people attending today have perhaps read the chapter that concludes this book called Frequently Asked Questions, which I thought was particularly nice because these are often many of the things that people come at you with whenever you mention the word degrowth. So without further ado, over to you, Giorgos.
Yeah. Thank you, Siddharth, for the presentation. And thank you for inviting me to your seminar. I don't know if you can see, I put a little bit the cover of the book so that you can see it. We struggled a little bit with the cover because we didn't know how to best capture the idea of degrowth. And you know, this type of book covers, you always have back and forths with the editors and the designers that they have their own opinion. We liked that it was a bicycle. I think the idea came from the editors for a bicycle. And we like that it seems to be a man driving the child to school or wherever. I mean, it's a thing you see quite often nowadays, but it would be like really strange for, maybe not in Norway, but in Greece definitely would be strange for my father's generation to see a father taking a bike and getting the child around or getting it to school. For us, this image captured actually two arguments of the book, two basic ideas. The one is a saying that Ivan Illich, a scholar that has influenced a lot degrowth, he had at the beginning of his book on energy and equity, and he was saying socialism will only arrive in a bicycle. It was actually the saying of a ministry from Chile. I don't remember now the name of the ministry from Chile, but I've learned it from Ivan Illich. And I mean, you might not be in favor of socialism, but we might call it in terms of what we are discussing these days, in terms of a big transformation that we all agree is necessary. And we can say metaphorically, will only come in a bicycle, which Illich meant will only come with tools that they are going to be simple, like a bicycle is a simple tool, convivial tools, Illich called them, tools and technologies that we can govern and we can manage. And a bicycle that it's a slow means of transport. It's not the high-speed train. It's not like a jet fuel without that uses, I don't know, hydrogen made by nuclear power generators, or I don't know what's the next crazy idea about how we can fly without emitting carbon in how many years. But it's gonna come slow. So the future, a desirable future of transformation is gonna come slow, like a bicycle, slow and simple. And this is captured here in this image. The other thing that it's captured and that we emphasize a lot in the book, and we consider a core premise of the idea of degrowth, is care. And it's care, and care that has to be universalized, care that has been the unpaid and uncompensated and undervalued role that mostly women have carried up to now, but that it's now redistributed towards men. And I have to say, it's not only a burden, it's also a pleasure to have the opportunity. For example, I've had the opportunity to take care of my twin daughters that are 9 months old this last month, and it's something I appreciate. So care is also a central signifier of degrowth. So along slow and simplicity, caring, and putting emphasis on the economies of care, which we consider is the bedrock also of the productive economy, but it's also the part of the economy where there are injustices, but there are also untapped possibilities for meaning and well-being to develop if this economy is organized properly. So these two things are captured by these CMADs. Now, what is not captured, and I think it's a little bit, it could be misleading about the content of book. One is like, the old Europe is I don't know if you can see it well, the image, but it's like an old European square. I don't know which city is it. It looks like any German or could be a Dutch or French city. And what doesn't capture? It captures the fact that public space is also something we emphasize on degrowth. But what it doesn't capture first is it doesn't capture one other idea that we wanted to be captured by the image. This is the emphasis we put on commoning and commons. So on the one hand, a public square is and can be a commons, but the way it is depicted here of people, individuals or couples going in their everyday business, each one on their own, is not what we have in mind when we talk about the growth. So in the growth, we emphasize the importance of reclaiming and reconstituting the commons, commoning, as we call it, and it's a very central idea in our book, to which we develop a full chapter. So the way we think a transition akin to degrowth can emerge is by starting by putting more and more emphasis on commons that people are producing in their everyday, with their everyday activities. And by commons, we understand them in an extended way, not only forest and water, that is the traditional commons that environmentalists have looked upon in the school of Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winner, but commons also in the sense of cooperatives, in the sense of food networks where producers and consumers come together, in the form of time banks, in the form, if you want, of occupied squares, or in the form of a public feast in the carnival, or a public dinner that takes place out in a square, and people come together, organize, share resources, share efforts, and share pleasures. So for us, this is not captured by this image because the square is a little bit empty, but that we would like ideally to capture. And finally, to finish talking about the image, but it's to give you a little bit of a feeling about the growth is in a way that it's not the formal one of following the book chapter by chapter, no? There is a problem of old Europe here. So it's old Europe as being like, for an American, this might make sense. Okay, the growth for the Americans is to regress to some European standard of consumption or of GDP, or it might also appear attractive in the sense, that for progressive Americans, social democracy type of Norway is the ideal, which is far for their country, for their system. But on the other hand, for us, like the European ideal shouldn't be romanticized that much. So Europe and the good standard of living that we have enjoyed as middle-class Europeans has, to a large extent, we argue in this book, built on the back of unequal exchange with the rest of the world, and has like a strong legacy of colonialism and a strong legacy of pillaging the rest of the world for cheap resources, or for or for using people as cheap labor to produce the goods that we have consumed in Europe, and have partly been responsible for the relatively good lives that the last 3 generations of us and comfortable lives have lived. This is not to underplay or reject the battles that the working class have won in Europe, and the welfare state, and the various benefits that we have enjoyed, and we shouldn't be taking them for granted. Capital and those who have money wouldn't have given them just because there was growth or because there was cheap resources coming from the rest of the world. But at the same token, I think we should be aware that this pastoral European landscape of a relaxed square hides a lot of injustice behind. And if it is to be sustained in the future and to become sustainable, these unjust flows of resources from the rest of the world have to be addressed. And this is how we see degrowth. So we see degrowth as a critique in the belly of the beast meaning Europe and North America, which is where we are writing from, the four authors, of an idea that it is Western and an idea that has been part and parcel of capitalism and colonialism, and an idea that has been exported to the rest of the world and has been hegemonic to the extent that it has sidelined all other alternatives way of being, of organizing the economy, of organizing society that might emerge autochthonously from in other places of the world. So our idea in the book, and we emphasize that, we call for degrowth in Europe and North America, which means we call for an abolishment of the pursuit and standard of judging our societies by the standard of constant increase of production and consumption. So we call for an abolishing this in our part of the world, and we also call for a radical reduction of resource and energy use, unlike anything seen in the past. Both by, of course, technological improvements, but also by behavioral and lifestyle changes, and fundamentally by economic restructuring and a general economic slowdown, what we call as degrowth. We call for this in our part of the world, in Europe and in North America, because that's the part we know, that's the part we study, that's the part we live in, and that's the part we can talk about. We don't call for degrowth in the rest of the world, but that doesn't mean that degrowth is not relevant for the rest of the world. Degrowth, not in the sense of reducing production and consumption, but for example, degrowth, as Arturo Escobar, a famous anthropologist, said when we launched the book in the University of Florida on Monday, he said, like in Latin America and in Colombia that he studies and he is from, there is a need for degrowth in extractivism. So he said the growth of what he considers to be the occupational forces, he called them, of the territory of Colombia, which are there just to extract resources at as low cost as possible, and they don't let people on the territory develop their own modes of livelihood and their own ideas of buen vivir, of the good life. So in that sense, yes, it's something we argue and we call for our part of the world. We emphasize also the responsibility in global terms of Europe to make ecological space for the rest of the world. So unless our energy consumption and production and emissions decline radically, drastically here, there is no feasible or visible scenario of avoiding climate change and of not shifting the costs of climate change to those most vulnerable, which are outside the borders of our country. That doesn't mean that we won't suffer here too, but others will suffer much more. So we are arguing that the only scenario compatible with a global climate and social justice is one where Europe and North America seriously degrow. I explained what we mean by degrowth. I have like 7 minutes more to share a few thoughts. Just to say that because I think it would be much nicer if you ask me the questions and we do it like that, and also you can ask me also about the questions if you've read them from the book, but these questions that I have in the book have been developed over the years by debates like the one we have now, where many questions come and to which we have developed a set of responses. Now, what we try to do a little bit in this book, which is a little bit braver than previous attempts or the attempts of others who write about degrowth, is like, I mean, the standard critique will be like, yes, that sounds nice what you're saying, but it's politically impossible and socially impossible, you know, like go tell this to the people who want to buy things in Christmas. I mean, these people are us, no, it's not someone else, who want to fly, who want to do this. Go tell that to governments, go tell that to the 40% of Americans who vote Trump, but also to, I would say, also to the 40% who vote Biden. There is a big difference there in terms of their view of how important growth is. So yes, it's politically very difficult. I like a phrase that William Rees wrote, and that he said, the ecologically necessary might be politically impossible, but the politically acceptable is ecologically ecologically impossible or irrelevant. He said something along these lines, which I think sums it up well. And the first response to this critique would be, even if it's politically impossible, that doesn't change the fact that it's true, that it's necessary. I mean, we might argue whether it's possible or not, but the fact that what we advocate as the growth might be politically very difficult doesn't mean that green growth or some other techno fantasy is any more true for that reason. But we take seriously the fact that we have to create plausible scenarios of transition to something akin to degrowth. Otherwise, it just stays at the level of critique now, of critiquing growth, which has been the case since the Limits to Growth report 50 years ago, but doesn't go further than critique. So we take very seriously the effort to flesh out an alternative. And the alternative we flesh out consists of, first of all, looking at the grassroots that want something akin to degrowth, not in the name of degrowth, but who live every day and practice something degrowth. And that's where we emphasize the economies of the commons, or what feminist economists Gibson Graham call community economies. All these economies that they're not a standard market for profit economy activities, but that they are all around us, and they are cooperative efforts that do things differently, that put emphasis on use value rather than profit and exchange value. So that's one thing, that's the grassroots. Then we have policies, and we address at least 5 policies that we think would be core leverages if we were to move in a degrowth direction. And the first one is like a Green New Deal, but that wouldn't be funded in an expansionary way. So a Green New Deal is like a big reinvestment program into energy, transport, and agriculture to green these sectors. The second proposal we have is a universal care income, which is a universal basic income, but with an emphasis on compensating the uncompensated and undervalued work of care and caretaking, together with universal basic services. We have this as the second proposal. The third one is a reduction of the working week. The fourth one is a support of economy of the commons and solidarity economies actively with legislation and public financing. And the fifth one is an overhaul of the taxation system to tax carbon and resources instead of work and labor, and also wealth and maximum income taxes. I'm saying these things a little bit fast, but this is the policy package of 5 policies we have. Then we have the economy of the commons, which is the grassroots that it's organizing to live differently. And then we create a plausible scenario of how could this unfold. And we argue that the more these local economies of commons or regional economies of commons expand, and more we and other people put more of our time in these economies as opposed to the conventional market economies, the more a different sphere of community economies would expand against that of market economies, a less commodified economy of commons. Now, we know that capitalism and the market economy will not take that easily. So if this happens, they will try to subdue and either commodify or legislate out of existence this competing economy. So there we argue that it's really important that if a conscience of those who participate in these economies grows by participating in these economies and by living differently and by wanting to defend their commons, then the next step and the necessary step is a political movement to expand that. And the political movement and the political conflict is inevitable there. And this political conflict and political movement will decide whether a different future transformation is possible or is not possible. And it's not something that can be predicted. Now, this political movement, of course, needs also policies and institutional changes and political demands to put in place if it takes state power to facilitate the opening of space for alternative economies beyond growth. And this is where the 5 policies come into play. So if there is to be a political movement for the commons and takes power, what could it do differently than it's done right now? This sounds quite speculative, but it's not so speculative. It's based on our experience here in Barcelona, where indeed there was a very vibrant community economy and cooperative economies. Cooperative economy in the city has been here ever since the fall of the dictatorship, and it dates back to the anarchist period in Barcelona. So there is a long historical tradition of cooperative economy. With the occupation of the squares in the Occupy Squares, or Indignado movement as it was called here, this economy and this society evolved into a political movement. A political party was founded in the squares. After the squares was founded, a lot of the people participating in the commons economies became part of this movement. And this movement won the elections in 2015 and has been governing the city since then. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect government. I'm not going to idealize it or romanticize it, but it is one plausible path. And this government since then has done a lot, as we explain in the book, to open up and defend the commons and try to create economic alternatives beyond the one-way future that was portrayed before of Barcelona, competing to attract foreign capital to become like the brand name of, I don't know what, the digital hub of Europe and tourist hub of Europe, etc. So it has tried to charter an alternative, and it has done also a lot of interesting things inside the city, from slowing down traffic in the city to trying to revitalize the neighborhoods, to developing a bike sharing infrastructure, and many other things. So this micro example serves to us as a model to think of how a political transition to what we are advocating in this book could become plausible. Okay, so I stop here and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Right. Thank you so much, Giorgos. Just to get the ball rolling, I already see a question in the chat, but I did want to ask you to reflect on one of your most recent articles. It's with Jason Hickel, and its title is "Green Growth Possible?" in a journal called New Political Economy. And it's been sort of remarkably well cited just within the past year or so. What is your impression of the conversation and how it's developing in terms of how other scholars have engaged?
I think it's a little bit stuck, this conversation, but like many conversations which I think are politically sensitive are stuck, and then you have two camps and each one is refining its argument and its data. But I mean, the argument we make in the paper is that the UN, World Bank, everyone is talking about green growth. So we're saying, okay, is this happening, or is it possible, or is it just wishful thinking and wishful talking? And we look at two things. We look at the resources and we look at carbon emissions. Now, there is a difference between resources and carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are a particular resource, are the side effect of fossil fuels. So no one can, let's say, argue from fundamentals that there is no reason why you can't substitute one source of energy for another, fossil fuels for another source of energy. Or there are, of course, a lot of path dependencies and lock-ins and vested interests that make it difficult. But theoretically, it's not impossible to think that we can decouple GDP from fossil fuel use. And I mean, we have to decouple it one way or the other, even if we go for degrowth. There's no way that we can continue at the same level of use of fossil fuels and technologies using fossil fuels. But for resources in general, it's a different question, because then it becomes a little bit more theoretical. Can the economy really grow without using more and more resources? And resources there meaning whatever type of resources. So if you stop using fossil fuels, then you start using lithium and cobalt for renewables. So you switch, but overall resources might stay the same or increase. So there are two questions, and in both questions we say that those who call for green growth, the empirical record disproves their case. And in terms of resources, I mean, in terms of resources, it's pretty clear. If you look at the global resource use and the global GDP, they move almost hand in hand. I mean, GDP grew a little bit faster from mid-70s to mid-90s to end of 90s, a little bit faster. I mean, just a little bit faster, but they grew almost together. And since then, since the mid-2000s, actually resource use is growing faster than GDP. But more or less, it's a one-to-one relationship. Then if you do it on a cross-sectional country-by-country analysis, you find a relation of 0.8. So 1% growth in GDP, 0.8% growth in resource use. They are very coupled. And then we look even at the published scientific models, and we see that none of them predicts by 2050 a reduction in resource use. The best case scenario is that an increase that it's lower than GDP, and it's like 20 or 30%. So we're saying there is no sign of green growth, and no one is actually talking about green growth in the scientific literature apart from the policy documents of World Bank, etc. And if we go to carbon emissions, yes, GDP has grown faster than carbon emissions. There is some relative decoupling, as it's called, not absolute decoupling yet at the global level. Like emissions haven't started decreasing, that it's in absolute terms. Also, again, at the cross-sectional level, you find a relationship that it's from 0.6 to 1, like 1% growth in GDP corresponds to 0.6 to 1% growth in carbon emissions. And again, what we say there, if we look at future scenarios, if we take the IPCC scenarios of 1.5 degrees Celsius, all of them predict growth, apart from one. All of these scenarios predict growth, and then of course they cannot square emissions. They cannot square emissions to stay within 1.5 degrees with a level of decarbonization and renewable energy infrastructure foreseen. So the way to square it now is, you might be familiar with that, is to talk about negative emission technologies and how much carbon we can absorb from the atmosphere and then turn it into pellets. I mean, okay, it's good to look for technologies because probably we're gonna fail. So one way or the other, we have to absorb carbon. But the other fact is that to just square scenarios by assuming unrealistic and untested levels of carbon absorption, we're saying that's irresponsible, and it's really a fantasy. So again, we don't have a green growth there. So growth is catastrophic, and we just try to square it off by imagining some greening in the future that hasn't been tested. The only scenario that and now, yesterday, these days, there was another scenario produced in the same lines. The only scenarios that can stay within 1.5 degrees with decarbonization and renewable energy are also scenarios that allow for a radical reduction of energy use and the slowing down of the economy. So we argue that that's not green growth, that's green degrowth, and that's where support. Now, have we convinced the other side? No, we haven't, and I'm afraid I can go further and say what are the counter arguments of the other side, but I'm afraid there it's hard to convince one another, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now we have a couple of questions. If you'd like to ask directly, the easiest is that you unmute, switch on your video if you like. So first Kevin, then Max, and then Matthew. Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kallis. I enjoyed your reference to Ivan Illich's book, Tools for Conviviality. His work on deschooling addresses the need to abolish the current school system. And how do you think we can achieve his aim to de-school society and, end the current moribund school system?
Yeah, that's not something I've been. I have to stay within my limits now, and that's not a book of limits that I have read, and it's not something that I have thought carefully. The type of arguments we make, in the book are in favor of cooperative and care economies. So cooperative systems of schooling and cooperative systems of mutual care, of childcare and of elder care. So I would emphasize that, but I would say that I haven't thought along the lines of deschooling, and I'm not familiar with the argument of Illich. I have to say that many in the degrowth movement are in this direction of Illich, but I wouldn't say everyone.
Yeah, I guess the reason I asked this question is because I think, the basis of our capitalist society is it starts in schools, and this is training, if you like, the future growth agents of the capitalist society. So unless we address the issue of schooling where it all starts, I think it's going to be difficult to get this argument about degrowth to the new generation.
No, I agree. But I'm saying that I don't have something very more advanced than what you're saying to add. I think what you're saying sounds right to me, but it's not something that I have thought. I have thought in more detail, no? Because what you say, yes, it's common sense and makes sense, but I haven't thought about what would be reforms of the schooling system and of the education system in line with what we talk about in the book or we talk about in degrowth. Generally, we emphasize the importance of unlearning growth, and we are saying in the book that growth is not just about GDP, it's not about the wealthy 1%. We make a joke in the book and we say, even if they were to fly to Mars with Elon Musk and stay there, the hegemony of growth would not end in one day or the other, because it's something we are all we've all learned and we're all trained in, no? From scientists that we want to publish it here more and more and see our impact factor raise, you know, all these graphs we see on Google Scholar, they are all growth curves, you know, like growth curves dominates our everyday activity of everyone. And we're saying we need to unlearn that. And you're right to say that, yes, if we need to unlearn that, we have to start thinking about how to unlearn that in the school system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank
so
you.
Max Kaiser asked me to put his question forward on his behalf, and it's about the limits of the circular economy. He says, hello, Dr. Kallis. Could you remind us what the basics of thermodynamics and entropy are and how it relates to degrowth?
You saw that in the questions I have a question there about the circular economy, which I think is a good idea. Like recycling, reusing, reducing was one of the mottos of degrowth when Serge Latouche first wrote about it. So there's nothing to disagree there. It's just the idea that we can have an economy that keeps expanding and it becomes more and more circular, that it's problematic, because if we think the current industrial economy that it's so productive and so wasteful at the same time, basically broke circularity, which was the characteristic of the economy before, and made it into a huge linearity, you know, that you extract resources, you use them as fast as possible, and then you extract them out of sight also as fast as possible and as far as possible, you know. That's the model right now. It is extremely effective and efficient in producing wealth where it is controlled, but at the cost, of course, of shifting costs both to the extraction sites and to the disposal sites. Entropy, I mean, how to explain it in a simple way and not be caught red-handed by a physicist, because there might always be one and say like your explanation is vulgarly simple, you know, but to my students, or the examples I use sometimes, is like, you know, that the law of entropy is that everything on Earth and universe is, there is a tendency from order to disorder, like from ordered forms of energy to move towards disordered, and then if you want to put them back into order, you have to spend much more energy than the energy that was released in the transition from order to disorder. I mean, we can think very easy how easy it is to have disorder in our house without doing anything. Somehow the house becomes a mess, no? But then how much work it takes to bring it back to order. Or if we want to be more serious, we can think of water from heat. You have to put energy to heat the water, but then the water just gets cold on its own, you know. There is a tendency, but this is debated among physicists. It's much more complicated than I put it, or at least Giorgos Kallis put it, that there is a tendency for entropy to increase, and he described the economic process as an entropic process. It's a process that takes dense, high-ordered forms of energy or materials, uses them to produce useful services, and then produces low-ordered materials and energy. So the economic process, he argued, speeds up this entropy. So if you think fossil fuels took millions of years, billions of years for them to be stored below the earth, to become a dense form of energy, economic process, we are taking them, we're just using them now, and then we release them into a completely disordered form, which is carbon dioxide. So that's the entropic process, and Giorgos Kallis argued that the economy is an entropic process, and we have to realize that the current moment is a very specific moment where we tapped into an amazing source of low entropy resources that they are fossil fuels, but this is going to end.
So I think Matthew's question follows very nicely from this. Matthew, would you like to bring it up?
Sure, thanks, Siddharth. So what struck me about the talk is that there's a sort of theory part, and then there's the policy agenda part, which you laid out. But when it comes to that policy agenda, what strikes me is how similar it is in some respects to what you hear from proponents of green growth. So people like Carlotta Perez, if you look at what she's proposing, a lot of the same ideas are there: universal basic income, Green New Deal, carbon taxes. Carlotta is very interested in the social economy, done a lot of work on it with Robin Murray. So there's the question, like, is there such a big difference between the degrowth perspective and the green growth perspective? Kind of linked to that, when you laid out that policy agenda, what it also immediately made me think of was Denmark, because Denmark has a lot of those characteristics. It's put a huge amount of investment into energy efficiency and low carbon technologies over the last 40 years. It's got very high carbon and energy taxes and has done for the last 35, 40 years. It's got a very strong welfare state, not quite a universal basic income maybe, but very strong, and a very strong emphasis on the care of young children, very good arrangements for parental leave and so on. But it's also, as we know, it's a capitalist society which which has economic growth, and that makes me think is actually the question. So my question to you is actually, isn't this largely addressing the sort of symptom rather than the underlying cause? I mean, the underlying cause of economic growth is capitalism, so shouldn't we be? I'm quite surprised that the degrowth school doesn't then call for a much more radical agenda of change, looking at things like ownership, modes of production, really kind of pervasive changes in taxes and the basic economic relationships that we have in the system that actually produce growth in an underlying way. So a little bit of a kind of call for more radicalism. What do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, I fully agree with what you're saying. So yes, Carlotta Perez actually is one of the people that I think it's, I mean, we disagree on that she emphasizes green growth, like Matsukato also emphasizes green growth, but there are many other aspects in their work that I really like in terms of understanding the role of the state, in terms of understanding the role of the state in infrastructure and technological innovation. So it's not the person, let's say, there are people who defend green growth with much more opposing agendas to the one we have. But in the book, we make this argument. We know that, let's say, preemptively, we start the very chapter with this critique, and we're saying what we're going to describe here is proposed by other progressive people, and it's proposed also by the Green parties for quite some time now. So some of our proposals, but we're saying it makes a very big difference whether you see these proposals as part of a radical agenda of moving in a degrowth and commons direction, or if you see them as palliatives to the current system, that with a little bit of that, the current system can continue growing or can keep going as it goes. And your example of Denmark is fine, yes, because Denmark does certain of these things, but does them still within a logic of expansion and capitalism and growth. And at the end, not even the carbon emissions of Denmark, not to talk about GDP, but the carbon emissions of Denmark are not sustainable and are not generalizable at the global level. So Denmark has done better than others in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but its level is still at the level that if all the rest of the world, which is the only way I can think about carbon emissions now, if the rest of the world was emitting what Denmark emits, it's still super high. So obviously, yes, the model of Denmark, which I would call it a progressive model of green growth, is not enough. We have to go further than that, and capitalism is the problem, and we recognize that in the book. But like, sometimes I have a problem. Is like we go from capitalism is the problem to how do we think the transition beyond or outside of capitalism, and then the things you mentioned, I think. You mentioned the change of the ownership of means of production, of definitely certain means of production. So I think a lot of the proposals we have, for example, for universal basic services, for communalizing and turning into commons the basics of water, energy, housing, these are proposals we have inside. They are proposals that exactly are taking space out of capitalism and turning private property into commons, into public property. Basic income depending on how it's envisaged and how it's implemented, can also be a proposal that goes completely against the logic of capitalism. Depends though, because you can have a basic income. Financial Times are also talking about basic income, and Elon Musk and Zuckerberg, no? So, but the basic income, we argue, in a different mindset, in the idea that we're gonna take a share out of capital and we're gonna give it to caretakers for taking care of themselves, and everyone will be able to survive and have a decent mode of living without having to sell her labor for wage somewhere she doesn't want or he doesn't want. Again, we think that's a huge change to the capitalist system, and that's of course why it doesn't happen. We haven't seen any country, Denmark including, to implement a serious effort of basic income. So in one sense they are reformist and they seem easy, but like if we were to really push for these proposals radically, I think they're quite revolutionary. And I used two intellectuals there who have made a similar but not exactly the same argument. Andre Gortz, who called them revolutionary reforms, non-reformist reforms, he called them actually, which I think is a little bit captures the thing. Like a basic income looks like a reform, but if you do it, the whole system has completely to change to accommodate a serious basic income. And Slavoj Zizek, who also wrote at some point, like these reforms seem like super banal and reforms, but he says that's precisely why you should be demanding them, because they make common sense, they are obvious. People say, yes, that makes sense, a basic income for everyone, working less since we have more productivity. But the capitalist system cannot really take them because they completely go against the logic of the capitalist system. Capitalist system cannot tolerate that people will work 4 or 3 days per week because productivity has increased. Cannot tolerate that people will have a basic income and can decide that, you know what, I don't want to work for minimum wage job that you are offering me for a pittance. So there are reforms in one sense, but I think they're much more radical than it seems when I kind of say them like one after the other within 3 minutes,
Other questions for Giorgos? Just to keep the ball rolling while people are thinking, one of the things I really like that you bring up in the book and also in the FAQs chapter is that cheapness in a way drives consumption, that it's not that as soon as things get lower resource intensive that then we consume less. In fact, we consume more of it and faster. And sort of I feel like there's a tension there between a green growth argument that would then look at particular examples of success, and then a degrowth view where you seem to be leaning back and taking a systemic perspective and saying, look, the problem here is that the political economy doesn't allow you to have that decoupling where you have greater resource productivity and therefore end up consuming less. The real world drivers, the capitalist logic, if you like, as you've been discussing with regard to Matthew's question. So why is it that that's such a difficult argument to get a sort of popular appetite for? It's not to say that degrowth isn't a popular concept, but it seems to be that there's this stuck back and forth. Is it possible to communicate that systemic perspective in a way that can really take on the sort of powerful imagery of particular examples that seem to also capture the public imagination?
I mean, there are two things there. I mean, the first thing you said, I agree. And I sometimes when I want to provoke economists who say that decoupling is possible, I use the example of within capitalism, let's say, I use the example of labor productivity. So if you talk about labor productivity, an economist would always say, no, it's not going to lead to unemployment. No, it's not going to lead to less people working or less people used. Why? Because they tell you, oh, if we improve labor productivity, then, we're going to have growth. And with growth, we're going to employ more people. But then when they shift to the resource example, then somehow their resource productivity or resource efficiency is supposed to lead to less resource use. But I would argue that precisely on the same pattern that less labor productivity doesn't lead necessarily to less employment, precisely because there is growth, which then will employ more people and will need to have a cheap labor to employ. Just makes labor cheaper, let's say, and then it can be employed in other activities. The same thing happens with resources. You have resource productivity, which leads to more resource use. That's a particular way capitalist system works now, because it needs cheap resources and cheap labor in order to keep expanding. This doesn't mean that theoretically you couldn't have a situation where you limit how much, for example, how many hours people work, and therefore how much labor you can use now. And then the labor productivity that you have just releases people from work, and people work less and less. Or on the same token, you can say we're going to less and less resources, and more resource productivity means less and less resources. But for that, you need to put a limit, and this is where it doesn't resonate theoretically. Like theoretically, many advocates of green growth would tell you, yeah, there's no problem for capitalism to do that. We are arguing instead that, it's capitalism needs cheap labor and cheap resources. It's never going to put this limit and try to grow with the rest that remains to grow, just science and technology, etc. But then the argument becomes a little bit difficult to resolve rationally or empirically, because we would argue this hasn't happened in the past, and someone will tell you like, okay, this hasn't happened in the past, can happen in the future though, So there I think is where the debate about green growth versus degrowth gets stumbled. Now, for the population at large, I don't think that's a problem. That's not where degrowth hits a wall. I think where it's difficult is because we all live in capitalist economies that either grow or collapse, and we know what it means not to have growth. So then to talk about not having growth is really difficult. And I would say it's also difficult for anti-capitalists and those who are critical of capitalism to accept that growth is not desirable, because they will tell you growth under capitalism is the problem, but growth under a different system that wouldn't be necessarily growth of what we count now as GDP and would be growth of nice things is not a problem, and like a different system would develop what we need, etc. Which I don't think is a wrong argument per se, but I think it's still captured in this mindset of growth, which I think it's much more problematic than often acknowledged.
More questions coming in, first from Marius and then from Katie. Please go ahead and ask Giorgos yourself.
Hi, yeah, I can't get my camera on here, but oh yeah, there it is. No, yeah, thank you for the very interesting discussion. I just have been working a little bit with the concept of sufficiency myself, and I think that's quite interesting because it goes into the little bit more the nitty-gritty of how you can understand the types of services that are needed, and what type of needs do they cover, and how are needs, of course, also socially constructed. And it's kind of based on the idea that there are limits, of course, and also this donuts economics model of Katie Raworth, I think is also quite interesting, with recognizing the idea of limits into the understanding of economics. So I was just wondering, how does that? I haven't read the book, unfortunately, so I just think I've ordered it, so I'm going to read it. But I was just wondering how it fits in with the degrowth idea. Thank you.
No, absolutely. It's the same family of ideas, and they're very much related. So sufficiency is the way to go about thinking about that, moving from an emphasis on efficiency or productivity and moving on an emphasis on sufficiency. Research-wise, there's great work done right now. Julia Steinberger and her group are producing amazing work on trying to quantify what would the sufficient energy-wise system of living would look like, and they calculate that we could have 10 billion people living decent lives with half of the energy use that's needed right now. So I think also research-wise is fantastic work. And Kate's work in communicating a different set of economics, where we think of social minima, absolute social necessities, basic needs that have to be met within planetary boundaries. I think it's a good way of going on thinking about it. Dan O'Neill also and Julia Steinberger, their nice work on trying to quantify what good that might mean, living within planetary boundaries, how social needs can be satisfied. So I really like all this work. I think what we add from a degrowth perspective is, I think Matthew was who asked me. I don't. Yeah, we tend to be a little bit more into, which maybe didn't come out very strong now the way I presented the book, no. But we tend to be a little bit more aware that it's not just a matter of conceptualizing these things and saying we have to live within the limits, but that there is a system, a capitalist system, that it's bound to grow without limits or else collapse, you know. So we think it's much more important, no, it's equally important to understand how the capitalist system works and how we can have plausible transition pathways within it, and what kind of conflict and political alliances and struggles that would involve. So I think it's a parallel task, but equally important.
I think Katie's question follows very naturally here. Katie?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, lovely. Right, well, thank you for this. I'm really glad that this has been organised. It's really interesting. I'm currently reading the book, currently learning about degrowth. So it's something I've kind of come across in the last few months, and being quite interested in it, quite passionate about it. Really wanted to communicate it to others. My degree is kind of a split between the environment and communication. So my passion is really sort of to communicate these ideas to other people that may not have come across them, may not even be interested particularly. And I think with degrowth, the difficult thing, particularly in some sort of circles, for example, in sales, production and things like that, it goes completely against the grain. You know, the whole principle is based on continuous growth, beating last year's targets, just constantly just going up. So I just wondered what, you know, how we can more effectively communicate this idea.
Yeah, I mean that's a problem. I mean, yes, these are difficult questions. I mean, I've been thinking about it too. You know, that because it's a world that I don't interact so much, but if I interact through a friend or someone I know, or by watching a documentary or whatever about the marketing world or the actual corporate world or how food chains are operating, I mean, there's a huge part of the population that its daily living depends on this constant growth of the activity that they're involved in. And I would say in the book, we say it's not only the people involved in this type of super capitalistic competitive economic activity, but also it permeates to the rest of us. And I insist on us academics, you know, like more and more our logic is one of quantified growth year after year, although it's completely stupid for us. It's like completely performative, you know, it's almost as if it's to brainwash us, because it's not really that anyone also benefits from us publishing 10 papers instead of 15, or getting 1,000 citations instead of 500, you know, like you can get like 10 citations and have written something very important, and like a few people, I mean, I don't go into the details, but we're not even producing commercial profit, but it's like so pervasive, this idea, that it's difficult to say. But I mean, I call it idea, but it's not idea, it's material. So it has to change materially, and it has to change politically and economically. So my thing is not to go and lecture someone who works in marketing, a friend, and tell her or him, oh, you shouldn't sell more next year and be fired, you know, because they will be fired. So then I'm not offering there, or I'm not going to tell them they're stupid and they think about growth and they shouldn't, no. The level at which I intervene, at least academically, is to think, oh, what structural changes at the level of the economy and at the level of polity we could fight as citizens for, and that would allow different forms of economies to emerge and people find a meaningful living there rather than have to work as salesmen that have to sell more and more every year.
Thank you.
Great. I think there's been a bit of input on the side. Max asked if you could say something about the 4-day week in France, and Matthew perhaps wants to chip in again on how that might be compatible with capitalism.
The 4-day work week in France didn't really happen. I mean, what it happened, there is a long story there, but from what I understand, is like it was implemented, and then Sarkozy was elected, and he basically took all the teeth out of it, and at the end it wasn't really implemented. And I mean, the question was, how would it be implemented in sectors that they were not directly just a public sector, or you can implement it a little bit easier, let people live halfway on Friday, but how do you implement it on the public sector? How do you implement it on service workers, you know, especially low-paid service workers? So in that sense, unless you tell me that you went to France and Friday looked like a Sunday, I won't believe that there is a 4-day work week in France. So there isn't, and but there's been a lot of work by economists trying to prove that it didn't do anything, you know, which just doesn't make sense that it didn't do anything, you know, that it didn't improve the living of people. I mean, first of all, it didn't really happen, and to the other extent, we know that from 6 days to 5 days, there have been substantial improvements in terms of the quality of life of people, and even the impacts on the economy were not terrible as people say that if there is a 4-work week, the economy is going to collapse. So I think there is a lot of ideological work going on there, trying to dismiss the idea of a 4-day work week. But I don't think France has a 4-day work week, to be honest.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? We have a few minutes. Yeah, Matthew, you want to say something?
Just on the 4-day work week thing, I guess the way I think about it is, look, you know, there's no, in the 19th century, in the mills in the UK, the working week was 70 hours a week, you know, and now it's 35 and a half or whatever it is, or, you know, it's different in different countries. And the point about France is that, okay, a 4-day week, no, but we know that the working hours in France are much lower than they are in other capitalist countries like the US, for example, much, much lower. Mm-hmm. And you can see the difference, actually, if you go versus going to the US on a Sunday. But, you know, productivity per week per hour is higher in France, and productivity in the US, once you take that into account, it's about the same in the US and France. But I guess the point is that they're both, you know, they're both capitalist countries, and they're both growing, and they both have growing economies. So you can have a different number of working hours, or a different shorter working week, and so on. And generally, you know, working weeks in Europe will be shorter than the US, and probably shorter than in kind of economies in Asia as well. But you know, I guess it goes back to my question about that doesn't necessarily sort of get to grips with the underlying issue about growing economies.
Yeah,
just an observation.
No, I agree with this. Just to say that the logic we go is a little bit different than perhaps I presented. So the idea is not like, okay, we want the growth, how do we go there? We go by reducing the working week. We reduce by reducing the working hours, you know. The logic goes the other way. Like we have economies that have to contract, use less and less resources. And how can this become socially sustainable? And we're saying like there's gonna be less paid work to go around. But one way of going about is like reducing working hours so that everyone can share the available work. So that's, let's say the argument is a little bit moves the other direction. But I agree with what you're saying. Yes, just by changing the working hours will not make a capitalist economy suddenly a degrowth economy. But I think by adding all the 5 changes that we have in the radical variant, and perhaps a few more that we don't have there, but it's like how we produce money, how we circulate money, etc. And especially which services and what part of the economy becomes a commons and what remains a private property. I think in an ideal scenario that all these changes took place, then I would think that France would look very different, wouldn't look like a capitalist country. But that's in the ideal scenario that all these changes take place together. Because the other thing is like, yes, we criticize capitalism, but then again, yes, we say the means of production, yes, the way finance works, yes, the way everything becomes commodified and it's part of markets, yes. But then when we have to specify the alternative, it has to be sketched somehow. So that's an effort to sketch the alternatives, starting from what already exists, and not imagine suddenly, you know, an overthrow of the palace and then like starting from zero and organizing everything completely different, you know. Even if it was to be organized completely different, how would it be organized? differently. That's a little bit where the direction we're going with this institutional changes.
I see we're on the hour. I'll allow one last question from Folke, who might want to ask it himself. I can read it out. Folke says, we have a lot of metrics for carbon emissions, but not so much about resource use. How do you look at the ecological footprint concept? I can perhaps add that he's involved as a citizen in Sweden in organizing an event next year, drawing on your body of work as well.
Thank you. No, there are pretty good indicators for material flows. There is the whole UN database. There is the work of the group of Marina Fischer-Kowalski and many other people now in Austria doing amazing work on quantifying material flows. And I mean, the latest research there is to quantify material footprints, which is how much materials are embedded also in the imports that they are coming. That we are using, we are consuming in our economies, but they are produced somewhere else. And there are quite good methods developed there. So material footprint, I really like it as a method. One critique there is like, okay, how do you aggregate all these different things? You know, so when I say resource use grows hand in hand with GDP, I do a big aggregation, which is to aggregate tons of fossil fuels with tons of cement, with tons of gold. Obviously, there is a problem when we do that. But I think of how we aggregate things in the economy. You know, we aggregate them according to their price, so it's not much less problematic. And the thing is also, if you separate these materials per category, you see a similar pattern. So the aggregate is not that different in terms of its trend from its constituents. So I think we do have good. Now, the ecological footprint, I don't like it so much, to be honest, because I don't like it because it tries to turn everything into land. It tries to take things that are not land related into land. And I think then it becomes too speculative and it can be manipulated in many ways. So I think scientifically there have been some critiques that I've read of the ecological footprint method that have convinced me that it's simply not a good method. I mean, the material flows, also aggregating them, as I said, is problematic, but at least, you know, you're measuring tons of materials and that's what you're talking about. The ecological footprint of talking about carbon emissions, changing them into the land equivalent of the forest you need to plant in order to absorb these carbon emissions starts becoming a little bit too much. And I have also some problems with the communicative idea, which I understand is powerful, this idea that we use 2 or 3 Earths, I don't remember how many, each year, or we already used Earth this year and it's still April, you know. Fine, but then, you know, it's April and then nothing happened and then we keep living until December. And it's like, so I wonder also how powerful this communicative idea is after a while. Or we use 2 or 3 Earths, fine, but we're still here and we live in 1 Earth. You know, like I have also a problem with this. We are using too much things. I don't think it's so powerful as we environmentalists sometimes think it is. And I criticize actually this framing of the environmental question on my book, Limits Why Malthus Was Wrong. That was my previous book and the one I'm very proud of, because I try to a little bit call for environmentalists to break out of this mold of framing the Earth as a limited planet that we are overusing and we are using too much of it, because I think it's a problematic actually framing of the question.
Giorgos, thank you for your work, for how much you've contributed and for taking the time out today, and to everybody for coming. But it was great having you. We'll say thank you and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Siddharth, for organizing it. Thank you very much.